Hello, come on in. I'd like to welcome you to your preview of the Neon Museum. My name is Lenny Davidson. I've been collecting and researching neon signs for the past 40 years, and this museum is the product of that work. Today, though the museum's not open to the public, you'll get a sense of what the museum's about. Particularly, there's different levels that we'll be getting into. One of them is kind of what I would think of as sort of the dazzling level. You could come into here almost like it's an outsider art site and just be blown away by the neon, by the accumulation of neon, by the colors of the neon, by the mass of neon signs in this space. You could come in this museum and sit here and sit in a chair and spin yourself around and just be awed, I hope, by the variety of signs. We'll start looking at the signs as art pieces, looking at specific signs, and then we'll go into sort of what I think of as the third level of this, which is really the culture and the history that the signs represent. I'll eventually talk about how this is a participatory museum, and it's not just about me and my staff and these signs, it's about people from across the United States, and particularly Philadelphia, who know about the signs and can contribute to our understanding of what the signs represent, and of 20th century American culture. I mean, beyond just taking in the light of the signs, I think the next level of appreciating neon is really looking at it as a craft and as an art, and particularly as a folk art, because the people who made these signs were generally not trained in art. They certainly weren't trained in fine art. Most of the signs were made by mom and pop businesses where you might have a little bit of an artistic skill, but you know, these things were made during the golden age of comic books. They were made when we had newspapers, multiple papers in different cities, and lots of cartooning. So there was that kind of cartoon folk art mentality that went into the development of these signs. This ray gun was in a store in Philadelphia called Rocket Ships and Accessories, and my friend Joel Spivak ran that store. His wife is a fine artist, a wonderful artist, Diane Keller, and she did the design for the ray gun, and it was made by a two-bender in West Philly, Joe Dunn. And another sign that was done by a trained artist was the ice cream cone, which was made by an artist. We have several of his pieces. Very interesting Philadelphia artist named Anson Kenny. But beyond that, everything else was typically designed and executed by a sign shop. Particularly interesting to me is the photo supply sign, the animated camera, which is double-sided, was made in the mid-50s and didn't make it through a hurricane. There was a hurricane that blew through the suburbs of Philadelphia and disabled that sign, and since that time, the owner of Schwartz's camera kept the sign up for many years and kept having to do repairs on the sign. It's a difficult thing to maintain. But when he closed his business, I was able to get the sign and restore it, because there's very little neon left on it. The animation didn't work. So that was one of the greatest, really, pieces of folk art, I think, that we have in our collection. One of the ones that catches a lot of attention is the hair replacement center sign, which was designed by, I think, Philadelphia's most brilliant sign maker, a fellow named Joe Feldman, who ran a company called Ajax Signs. And this is a good example of why I call this stuff folk art. I don't think a fine artist would think of designing a man and having him have a toupee that illuminates in a before and after kind of shot, but that's how Feldman worked. And we've got several of Joe Feldman's signs, including his masterpiece, the Pat Stake sign here. Another sign that I think is really interesting, just in terms of lettering, is the Saturn Club, where the lettering is done in a style called Beehive, which is a very unusual style, somewhat hard to read style of neon. Another sign that's interesting from a tube bending perspective is this 57 Chevy. It was made by a really crackerjack bender named Carol Falone. When I would show her work to other tube benders, they would look at it and they marvel. Here there's all kinds of color splices. There's little circles that she did. The bending is just really well done. At the very top of the wall is the McGillen sign, which was unfortunately, well, fortunately for me, it was thrown out by McGillen's because they were having a lot of maintenance problems, which I can understand. It's a double-sided sign. It had been outdoors for years. Transformers were failing. And so I was able to get the sign and do the restoration. And we're very proud to have that. And McGillen's is a big supporter of the Neon Museum. So they got a new sign that's a replica of the old. They had that fabricated. Another piece on this wall that I think is really interesting is this particular clock, which is called a bowling clock. It doesn't have the original face on it. Originally, it would have advertised a bowling alley, and it would have advertised both league and open bowling times. So these clocks were made with 4 neon tubes and a low voltage switch that ran back to the checkout counter. And when it was time for league bowling, you would switch the color, and the red would illuminate the portion of the face that portrayed league bowling, and then once league bowling was over, you'd switch back to open bowling. To me, one of the most beautiful signs is, and rare, is this Howard Johnson's lamplighter sign. I was able, when I got the sign, to fortunately have a lot of the original glass. So you'll notice the crimson red here. This is called clear ruby red glass. And the ruby that you get today, which is now made primarily in Italy or Germany, it's made overseas, doesn't have the same depth of color as the ruby when it was made domestically by companies like Sylvania in the United States. So if you're a neon aficionado, you always are looking for signs that have original stained glass, original ruby glass, original Noville gold glass, original midnight blue glass, because of just the beauty of those colors. The Pittsburgh paint sign was really a lucky break for me, in that was a sign made in the 1930s and it was never used. And I got a phone call from an antique dealer in North Carolina one day, and he said he's got a Pittsburgh paint sign, was I interested in it? I made him a small offer, and he said fine. And I later learned that he had offered the sign to PPG Industries, which is Pittsburgh Paint in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and they, being, a large bureaucracy, said, well, we'll get back to you. And they eventually did get back to him, and I can only imagine how much more money they would have given for this sign than what I offered to get it. The sign below it is a part of 2 65-foot long signs, which were in Glenside, Pennsylvania. These were also made by Joe Feldman at Ajax Sign. You could see the Ajax in the bottom left corner of the sign. And it was made for a company called Glenside Hardware, which was a corner hardware store. And Joe had these 65-foot long signs wrapping the corner. So there were 2 identical signs that had 5 hardware graphics on each face and triple stroke letters saying Glenside Hardware on each face. This was typical of Joe Feldman. People used to say that he threw in so much gingerbread on his signs, and I think these hardware graphics were the example of gingerbread that he put onto those signs. Most people notice first is our Dancing Elvis, which came from a bar called the Blue Suede Saloon in Philadelphia that was only open for a short time, but they invested in this kind of elaborate neon sign where you see Elvis dancing. Chez Vous, they would turn from a roller rink into a place for teenage dances that were run by a local DJ called Jerry Blavitt. Blavitt went on to be a Philadelphia celebrity and icon. We've got some old record albums that Blavitt put together. He's very into doo-wop and oldies and sort of educated my generation in doo-wop, and that's why there's a great passion in Philadelphia for a cappella doo-wop music. This D was used on the stage of a bar in Philadelphia on South Street called J.C. Dobbs. So you used to walk up to the second floor of Dobbs and walk up through this dark staircase, and they'd have photos of people who had appeared there. And it was a bar where people started out, but a lot of the people who appeared there became famous. This is one of the most elaborate signs I've ever seen. If you count up the housing holes, there were 39 tubes just on this sign. At the time we got it, there were only 2 tubes left. So these are the 2 tubes that we were able to salvage. But what would be wonderful would be to restore the other 37 tubes. The only problem is there's no intact photos that we've been able to find of the sign with the neon on it at that period. The best photos I have where you can really see the neon were done in the 1980s, and there were, maybe 7 or 8 tubes that were noticeable. Now, I could figure out, like an archaeologist, what a lot of tubes were like. I know that there was a diamond that went over here, and there were rubies, the red porcelain over here, and so on. And there were outlines in red and green of the crown. But what are all these housings doing in the middle? People have told me, well, it spelled out Pats, and it was animated in the middle. I just don't know. I could probably restore 90% of it fairly accurately, but there's 10% of it that I would just have to make up or make some assumptions about. Horn and Hardart would rival Pat's for the most famous name in restaurants in Philadelphia. They probably have served more meals to Philadelphians since they were started in the 1890s than any other company. At one point, there were about 70 Horn and Hardart automats. They invented the automat in 1902. The most important historical piece in the collection, which is the Bulova Watches clock. That clock came from the 1939 New York World's Fair. I've never figured out why this happened, but we know that 3 and possibly 4 of these clocks came to Philadelphia and were hung above jewelry stores in Philadelphia after the fair. Levis's has a lot of personal history to me because my dad would take me there after basketball games, but his father used to take him to Levis's, and then I used to take my son to Levis's. So when this sign closed, it was really heartbreaking for me, when the shop closed. And the sign ended up in an architectural salvage place, and I, of course, bought it and restored it, and so now I'm the curator of the Levis's sign. Again, it's a sign, but it's more than a sign for me and for a lot of people, and that's exemplified by the 50-year club sign that we have on the wall. People who used to go to Levis's for 50 years would give them their name. When I started learning about neon, I became fascinated by figural signs, and initially those were the kinds of signs I most wanted to collect. If it was pictorial, if it was animated, they were the best signs from my perspective. Today, I still love those kinds of signs, but the history is very interesting too. So if it's just lettering, but it's got an interesting history behind it, that becomes a valuable sign to me also. We've made up sign cards. So these are guides in the museum that tell you a story and a history about each of the signs. I talked to the old guys about how they started the business and how they were second generation in the business and who started and all that. Taking down a sign with my hands, but I'm listening with my ears and trying to memorize what they're saying or thinking of key points. And then when I get outside of there, I start writing up notes and make notes of these things. So when it came to actually writing up the sign cards, part of it is oral history that I've already collected. Part of it is just looking these things up. So far, this is all things that we're providing to you. But we're going to have memberships at the museum, and we want your participation in a lot of ways in the museum. One of the ways, the most obvious way, is if you know something about a sign. If your aunt worked at Horn and Hardart's, if you went to Levis's Hot Dog, if you know something about Sunray Drugs, we want you to tell you that story. So when you come into the Neon Museum, you knew something about that business, write it up on 3x5 card and post it on our wall. And we'll be collecting that kind of oral history. If you've got a big story, more than something for a 3x5 card, we'll tape record you. We're collecting old Philadelphia tins and crates to to keep these museum guides in. And we've got about 5 or 6 of them so far, but we need a few more. So if you have crates or tins, that's another way you can participate in the museum. It's a very flexible space, and a lot of the junk over here is really just storage that will be out of the way. So it will open up this area. So what you have to picture is basically a wall for sales where we've got t-shirts, books. We're adding to our inventory small neon signs that are for sale, then a library and a lounge, then an art gallery. And the other thing that's not here yet is our video program. We're going to have a large screen television. We've been gathering videos and PowerPoints, which is another way that you can participate in this museum. These are not my videos and PowerPoints. These are things that have been sent to us. Another way that you'll get information about our 3 main topics, neon, Philly history, and 20th century American culture, is by looking at the video presentations. So these are all ways that you can get involved. You can come in and give us an idea. You want to do a talk here, you'd like to do a presentation, you'd like to run a class, you'd like to show us your glass art. We're very open to it. It's made to be a flexible space. We can have parties here. One thing that I didn't mention, which I guess should be obvious because we've got a neon to order sign here, but we do make custom neon signs. We don't just make these small standard pieces, but we can do anything from movie marquees down to signs for your individual home or business.